Well, as we said earlier, Australia's biggest industrial union, the Australian Workers' Union, has backed the government's carbon tax, saying it's confident no jobs will be lost because of the tax. Its National Secretary, Paul Howes, joins me now in the studio. Paul Howes, welcome to Lateline.
G'day, Ali.
As we just said, you've crunched the numbers. You say that the government's package will ensure, I should say, that jobs won't be lost. Given that the carbon tax is just one of a whole raft of issues that businesses have to deal with, how can you be so sure that down the track it won't be the one thing that perhaps tips a company over the cost curve and makes them uncompetitive and means they end up laying off jobs? Because it's never as simple as one factor, is it?
Well, because when we looked at the issue of carbon pricing, we set some very clear benchmarks. We said we weren't going to support a package which would unnecessarily cost the jobs of AWU members. We asked for 94.5% compensation for most emissions-intensive trade-exposed industries in which 85% of AWU members work. We said that the steel industry needs to be paying nothing until the dollar recovers, because of course that's creating a huge impost on that sector at the moment. And the government delivered on that. They delivered 94.5% compensation for most ETs, the same for steel, plus a $300 million transition fund, which very disappointingly Tony Abbott said he won't support. These are the key issues that we had to tick off. Now, it's a hard issue for our union, it's a hard issue for our members. But when we look at this, we have to accept the reality that no matter who's in government, carbon pricing is an inevitability. There will be a price on carbon in this country. We may not like it, but it's going to happen. And we have to work to get the best deal we can for our members, and we're confident that the package, as announced by the government, will not cost the jobs of any of our members. And we'll make sure that as we negotiate with employers that they aren't sacrificing our members' jobs on the altar of some type of political campaign.
That $300 million assistance package, for example, for steel, though, that only lasts 4 years. What happens then? Well,
it lasts for 4 years with a built-in review mechanism, depending on what the rest of the world does on carbon pricing. The same with the compensation for emissions-intensive trade-exposed industries. Those review mechanisms are very important. Those review mechanisms were supported by many of the members of the coalition frontbench during the negotiation over the CPRS. But that $300 million for steel will be the difference between steel surviving or it falling over.
But I'm just wondering how far out your economic modelling for no jobs lost actually went. How many years out?
Well, we looked at the whole decay factor over the 4 years. We looked at the impact of global pricing and whether you will have more than 70% of the world in a carbon pricing mechanism on a sectorial approach.
So you're only looking at 4 years, though? That's the limit?
But we also looked at the review processes which the government has built into the package. You know, our message is the same as the steel industry's message. BlueScope Steel, One Steel have both welcomed this package, agreed to a sectorial approach and agree that it won't cost jobs of steel workers in the short term. Now, the steel industry is under enormous pressure. Australian manufacturing is under enormous pressure. And with a carbon price or without a carbon price, things are going to be tough for manufacturing when you have a dollar hovering between 105 and 110. And there's much more the government and all political parties need to do. But I'll tell you this, Tony Abbott went to about 30 of our AWU workplaces across the country, including all of our major steel producing centres. He looked AWU members in the eyes and said, I will back you, I will defend the steel industry. And the day that the government announces the biggest investment in the Australian steel sector since World War II, what does he say? I ain't voting for it. Because consistently on this issue, the guy just flips and flops. We saw it today. A 5% cut's good, a 5% cut's rubbish.
All right, I just want to get back though to, because this is a very firm commitment that you truly believe that no jobs are going to be lost. You're talking only jobs lost, or are you also talking jobs forgone? I wonder if you accept that it will potentially crimp growth in some of the industries.
And there'll be jobs created as well. There'll be jobs created in new industries. But we have said very clearly that no job need to be lost because of this carbon pricing mechanism. If you look at the bulk of AWU industries and the level of compensation that they are being given, you'll see the employers are saying the same. Jobs won't be lost in these sectors. Now, the steel industry hasn't expanded in Australia. In fact, the steel industry has been contracting in Australia over a 30 to 40 year period. Aluminium has expanded in some areas, but in terms of labour units, it has contracted with the introduction of new technology and new processes. But when we look at the potential for investment in clean technologies, you can't build wind power without steel, you can't build solar power without Australian glass and Australian aluminium. There is huge potential for the creation of jobs in those sectors. But what's important for us as a union now is to look at the policy settings that have been given to us, get the best deal possible, and this is a good deal.
Were you ever, though, not going to support this tax, economic modelling or no economic modelling? I mean, you played a key role in putting Julia Gillard into the Prime Ministership. This is her key big reform. Had you not supported it, wouldn't it be tantamount to saying, oops, I made a mistake, she wasn't the right person?
No, if the steel package hadn't been announced, if we hadn't got that 94.5% compensation, that is the GFC buffering on top of the compensation was originally in the original CPRS, of course we wouldn't have supported it. I'm accountable to the 135,000 members of the AWU. Many of the members of the union will be disappointed with today's decision. Some will be happy. Some will want us to go further.
It wasn't unanimous?
Well, it was unanimous by our leadership group, but there'll be members of the union that aren't happy. And I'll be going around the country over the next couple of months as we work through this hard issue. But I'm not, as a leader, I'm not going to put our head in the sand and say that we can just pretend this is going to go away, that the issue of carbon pricing is something we can ignore and oppose. I mean, we know that a coalition government or a Labor government will eventually introduce carbon pricing. We know the coalition's record in manufacturing. Every steel mill that's closed in this country has closed under a coalition government. And we know Tony Abbott's inconsistencies, so I don't take him at his word when he says that he'll stand up for manufacturing or not implement a carbon pricing regime into the future.
You've made the point that the government's made that this is a very tough reform, so it's no surprise that the government's suffering in the polls. But when you look at a primary vote of just 26%, is there a point where you get so far behind you can't get ahead?
Well, I see it as a challenge, and this is a matter of breaking or breaking through. It's important the government continues on the path of reform. I'm glad that we have a government that stands for something. You contrast with what we've got on the other side of politics. I mean, Tony Abbott is a political version of a choose-your-own-adventure book. I mean, depending on what audience he goes to, he changes the end of the story. You get to page 32. If you want a carbon price, you go to page 17. If the audience is hostile, go back to page 32 and you can change to page 51 where there's a different outcome. You need consistency to lead this country. This bloke has been believing that climate change is absolute crap, then saying that climate change is real. Today says that he will support, a Mamma Mia website says he'll support a 5% reduction in carbon emissions, then goes to a bunch of seniors and says that he won't.
Well, of course, there'd be a lot of people who would say there's been some inconsistency in Labor policy as well, if you listen to Julia Gillard. But can I just stick to the polls for a tick? Can I just stick to the polls? Can you understand why people are getting a little confused about why Kevin Rudd had to go? When you look at the polls, in the weeks leading up to Kevin Rudd's removal, the primary vote was in the early to mid-30s. It's been stuck, now in the high 20s, and it was in the low 30s. So why is Julia Gillard different to Kevin Rudd?
Well, if you look back at what the learned members of the press were saying at that time, why were they saying that Kevin had to go? Well, because he'd dumped the CPRS and that the government had lost its direction. I mean, sure, this is not a popular reform. Sure, it's tough. But the government and the Prime Minister have been very clear that they're going to pursue it. They're going to follow it through. And they're doing it in a Labor way. That's why we have given support to this package today. Not because we are some ratbag bunch of environmentalists and really want to deal with this issue, but frankly because we believe that they've developed a package which will do the right thing for the environment, but will also ensure that the 85% of AWU members who work in emissions-intensive trade-exposed industries' jobs will be protected.
But are you saying the polls had no bearing on your decision to assist in the removal of Kevin Rudd?
Well, the issue was about whether the government was heading in the right direction or not, and whether the government was prepared to tackle the big issues. Now, it's very clear that this government is prepared to tackle the big issues, is going to follow through and isn't going to be swayed by the polls. Sure, everyone would prefer higher poll ratings. Everyone would prefer that. But I would prefer, instead of high poll ratings, the government's actually going to deliver on its commitments and deliver on the reform that is needed. And I would rather I would rather that my union deal with this very complex issue of carbon pricing under a Labor government which is committed to manufacturing, rather than under a coalition government, because it will happen under them, a coalition government who flips and flops on every major point of policy on carbon, depending on which way the weather vane's heading.
Well, if that's what you think of a coalition policy, I mean, you said today that Blind Freddie could tell that the government sales campaign of its carbon tax hasn't been particularly successful, not been perfect, I think were the words that you used. Who do you blame for that mishandling?
Well, people make mistakes. I make mistakes on a daily basis. I'm sure you do, Ali. And I don't think, it's a matter of fact that a lot of the message hasn't gotten through. And I think it's important that now the detail is out there, that the government gets on the front foot and articulates that message proactively. I was one of the parties that was concerned, majorly concerned, when the government first announced the carbon tax without any detail. It was a very frustrating process between that announcement and getting the detail and wondering what was going to happen to the industries which my union so proudly represents.
Have they got the process right now?
Well, the detail is there, and what's happened in the meantime doesn't really matter. The detail is there, and what's clear is that you have a package which will deliver for our industries, which will assist with the creation of new jobs in the clean tech industries, which will help with that transition, but won't unfairly penalise Australian industry when the rest of the world hasn't acted.
But is that point getting across? Is that sales campaign now actually having an impact? Are people listening? Are people understanding?
Well, it's only been, 8 days since the announcement of the detail, and this is a very complex process. It's hard to get your head around. I speak to AW members on a daily basis who don't understand the policy and have constantly got questions. I've got questions about the impacts of different areas, and we've had to, commission a lot of research to ensure that we've ticked the boxes that we set ourselves on these issues. Now, the debate has been confused and I think has been distorted by some, which is not good. It's not good for public policy development in this country. I think we need to be more honest and open and transparent about what we're doing. Parties should be more honest and open and transparent about what their previous positions is. I can't understand how the Greens can back this package but couldn't back the CPRS back in 2008, 2009. I can't understand how the coalition and people like Joe Hockey and Scott Morrison and all those other major Turnbull supporters at the time could back the CPRS amended version but can't support this tax. That doesn't make any sense to me. And there doesn't seem to be much focus on the inconsistencies that lie with those parties. But I think it is important the government articulates their message transparently and clearly, and the people in this country understand that this reform is necessary. It's going to happen, whether it's imposed on us from the rest of the world or we do it domestically. And it will be tough. But once we get through to the detail, it won't be the end of the world.
We are out of time, but I want to ask you one other quick question, completely unrelated to the carbon tax. How comfortable are you with the fact that since the announcement of the plan for an asylum seeker swap with Malaysia, new arrivals are not being processed? In effect, we're holding various people here with their refugee status undetermined.
Well, Ali, my views on the asylum seeker question are well known, but it's, as I've said in the past, I've accepted that my view is a very small minority of Australians, and that hasn't been, people with my views haven't been very articulate or convincing in convincing the rest of the Australian population that this isn't an issue.
Do you believe processing should be restarted?
Absolutely. I mean, my view has always been that we should have an orderly processing system. I've never been a supporter of having children in detention. I understand the political realities of where this debate's at, and I can understand the need to have regional processing centres. It's something that I support. We don't want to be encouraging people to unnecessarily be coming to this country by boat, but I also think we need to inject some common sense and some rationality into this debate. And I find it a frustrating debate to talk about. It upsets me greatly that we haven't had that type of leadership in this country to articulate that this actually isn't the huge problem that so many people make it out to be, because it just isn't.
And that's on both sides of politics.
Absolutely.
Paul Howes, many thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Ali.